Speaking with us on France 24. After Saturday's bombing, the pressure is growing, it seems, on the Saudis. They deny responsibility, but Washington warns it's going to be reviewing its support for Riyadh's campaign. Where's this going?
I think it remains to be seen at this point. We've seen this pattern where after particularly egregious apparent airstrikes by the coalition, you do have this sort of outpouring of international condemnation. But if we look at what's happened over the past year and a half, it tends to sort of calm down after a bit. Also, for their part, the Houthis and their allies among the backers of Ali Abdullah Saleh have also, continued to give the Saudis a reason to fight the war since this attack and have given the U.S. a reason to back it. When we look at this attack, targeting the city of Taif in, the heart of Saudi Arabia, really, that's sort of something that will underline, really put the U.S. in an awkward position in the sense that the U.S. has committed to defending its ally, Saudi Arabia. And when you have this situation where the U.S. on the one hand is very concerned with its participation in this ongoing offensive in Yemen, but on the other hand is very concerned with the territorial integrity of Saudi, it just puts the Obama administration in a very awkward position. Is the territorial integrity of Saudi Arabia in question? Well, I mean, you have these continued missile attacks, so that as long as you have the Houthis and Ali Abdullah Saleh's backers continuing to launch attacks over into the Saudi border, that brings you to a position where the Saudis are able to say this is a matter of self-defense, and then the U.S. does feel obligated, particularly owing to the real strains in the U.S.-Saudi relationship over the past few years. The U.S. does feel obligated to continue to defend Saudi Arabia. That has nothing, that's completely separate with much of the problematic way in which the war is being waged in Yemen, and the fact that many of the coalition's actions over the past few weeks and months have done, particularly and most recently this bombing on Saturday, have done quite a lot to set back the possibility of a peaceful resolution to the conflict in Yemen, which is not just in the interest of the United States, but for that matter is also in the interest of Saudi Arabia and its neighbors. Just very briefly, Adam, so much of our attention has been focused on Syria. Would you say there's a double standard? I would completely say there's a double standard. When you look at it, the humanitarian crisis in Yemen is actually far worse than the humanitarian crisis in Syria when we're speaking numerically. You're dealing with 350 acutely malnourished children, acutely malnourished. Millions of children that are just standardly malnourished. A country where 20 million people are in need of humanitarian aid. And that's before we get to the fact that you're having violations of IHL committed by both sides. Most recently, as I said, apparently the Saudi airstrike on the funeral hall in Sana'a on Saturday. So yeah, I think it's something that's very odd for me that this is a war that the United States and the UK are intimately involved in, and yet it's getting nowhere near as much attention as the conflict in Syria has been getting. Adam Barron, many thanks for joining us there from Beirut. Well, joining us now, a man whose job has been peacemaking, Algerian diplomat Lakhdar Brahimi, former UN negotiator for Haiti, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Iraq, most recently for Syria. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thank you for having me.
As we're talking, the UN's envoy is here in Paris to talk about Yemen. What can he do?
He has been going around between the parties that are involved in this conflict. He has made a number of proposals. At one stage, I think everybody said they accepted his proposals as a basis for negotiations, but nothing has happened. It's a terrible tragedy.
Are the Saudis the key?
Yes, of course, they are very important. They are very important in the region in general, and there they are leading a coalition that is involved in the fighting. What is needed really is first for the Yemenis to understand that this is their country. It is the country of everybody on both sides. And the Yemenis have had in the past feuds amongst themselves, and they have solved them. So they have a very big responsibility to now reach out to one another. They haven't in the proper manner. And also the parties that are involved in the conflict from outside, supporting one side or the other, have got to understand that in these days, these kind of wars are not won. Nobody can win a war like this.
All right, and you heard the growing alarm over the killing of civilians, 2/3 of the victims in Yemen, civilians. Before his meeting with the French foreign minister for the UN envoy, Jean-Marc Ayrault was asked about France selling weapons to the Saudis, who are then bombing civilians.
Saudi Arabia, France's ally, causes a bloodbath in Yemen, which happened once again last Saturday with an attack on Shia civilians that killed 140 and wounded hundreds. We don't hear you speak up so much.
I haven't stopped denouncing the bombing of civilians anywhere, and that's also true for Yemen. This is the French stance.
But Saudi Arabia is our ally. Perhaps there are French arms being used in Yemen.
The current situation is not at all acceptable to us. The military solution is not a solution.
Does the West have a responsibility in what's going on by virtue of the fact that they sell weapons to the Saudis?
No, not by virtue of selling arms to Saudi Arabia, but by virtue of the fact that they are members of the Security Council. The job of the Security Council is to keep peace. And the Security Council has not been doing extremely well these last few years. We were told back in the 80s that the problem why the United Nations was not doing its job was because of the Cold War. The Cold War is over a long time ago. I mean, by the way, one feels from time to time that a new Cold War is in the making. But certainly the Security Council has a responsibility. The people of Yemen has a very, very big responsibility. They can reach to one another and help solve their problem. Their neighbors, instead of feeding the war, should really help the Yemenis solve the problem, not fight a war.
You're mentioning how sometimes you feel like the Cold War is back. Certainly, we saw those dueling resolutions over the weekend on Syria. It seems as though right now the Security Council is not the place to go if you want to try to get peace in Syria.
Well, it is the place that is supposed to be where you have to go. I'm a great believer in the United Nations. But the United Nations at the end, including the Security Council, will do as much or as little as its members want it to do. And the members of the Security Council these days, I think it would be a little bit too much to say that they are being irresponsible, but they certainly are not living up to their responsibility. These two resolutions last week on Syria, I've met quite a few people over the weekend who asked me to explain why there was two resolutions, why both were vetoed. I don't know why. And Syria is not being helped. Syria is not being helped by its neighbors. It's not being helped by the Security Council. It's not being helped by the European Union or the League of Arab States.
Lakhdar Brahimi, the Russians seem intransigent when it comes to the battle that's unfolding in Aleppo. At this particular point in time, how do you get a compromise? It doesn't seem possible.
Yes, it doesn't seem possible, but you see, only the impossible is worth of working on. In Syria, Aleppo is the last stage of a nightmare that has been going for 5 years. The Russians, I think one has to recognize, to give them credit for the fact that their analysis originally of what was happening in Syria was much better than anybody else's. I believed very, very much in the possibility of cooperation between the Americans and the Russians to lay the ground for a solution to the Syrian crisis.
Right.
I still think that is indispensable, and that is the only way. That's the only way to go.
Still hope, then, you're saying. Lakhdar Brahimi, many thanks for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thank you very much indeed.